Hi there, everyone. I want to talk about Malazan a little bit here, and I want to talk about kind of the power levels of Malazan. Um, and I just think it's kind of interesting because it's one of the things that sort of, in my opinion, sets Malazan apart from a lot of other fantasy series. And I got thinking about this here because for some reason, and I don't know why this popped into my head, but I was thinking back to a conversation from quite a few years ago. This must have been around 2018 because it was when a particular movie came out. Um, but anyway, I was talking with a friend of mine, and he had said, well, Game of Thrones had been on TV, right? And of course, it was a huge pop culture phenomenon, and it was very popular. A lot of people who weren't into fantasy really liked Game of Thrones, and I think there's a lot of different reasons for that, but in any case, my friend's sister. So my friend would be like kind of a fantasy nerd, like maybe me or people watching a video like this. His sister, his older sister, very, quote unquote, ordinary person. She was not into fantasy books, but she liked Game of Thrones, the show, so much that she wanted to read the novels, A Song of Ice and Fire. And apparently she did so, and she liked those books a lot. And she liked them so much that she wanted to find another good fantasy series to read. So that's kind of interesting in and of itself, kind of a um, gateway series that leads into other things, and that's an interesting thing you could talk about as to what gets people into fantasy and then where do they go from there. But in this case, for whatever reason, someone steered her towards Malazan. So she went from A Song of Ice and Fire, which she really enjoyed, to Malazan Book of the Fallen, which is, I remember remarking at the time, that's a very, very different kind of fantasy story or fantasy series if you compare the two. And I believe my comment at the time was that something like Malazan is more like Infinity War than Game of Thrones. And Infinity War, I mean the movie, which was out in 2018, I think, maybe 2019, I don't remember. But of course, that was a huge popular movie, and the reason I made that comparison is, and I think it shows some of what makes Malazan very interesting. And it's kind of a crude comparison, obviously, but bear with me here. So Malazan is like a super, super high-powered fantasy series in terms of the characters inhabiting the world and the power that they have access to. It's very, very high. You compare that to Game of Thrones, and Game of Thrones is a low power, kind of low level fantasy series. Um, it does have magic and it does have some monsters and stuff, but at a more very low level. Most of the characters are kind of moving the story with diplomacy and manipulation and politics and stuff, and it's not really the most decisive things in the story aren't really the raw power and how earth changing magic and epic horrible monsters and stuff are you know writing history with sheer power levels, right? Malazan is more like Infinity War because basically you've got a bunch of like Thanoses walking around and Doctor Stranges and Thor, Thunder Gods, and Iron Mans and stuff. Like Infinity War, like the whole Marvel kind of superhero thing, very high powered story, right? Like high level powerful characters. Um, and you could almost take Infinity War, like file off all the serial numbers and just like put it out as a sort of fantasy movie of sorts, and it would kind of work. But the idea I have is just as a comparison and thinking about Malazan. Malazan, you basically have a bunch of these kind of super powered characters running around, but it's on a scale even bigger than something like Infinity War because you have just tons of unbelievably powerful characters that have a really important role in the story. Now, of course, there's so many of them and the story is so complicated. None of them really wields kind of an undue influence. There's just so much going on. but it's not like there's just one final boss like a Thanos and everyone else is weak and they have to like kind of solve a puzzle to defeat him. There's tons of Thanos kind of characters running around, like superpowered space alien guys, but it's not like that. It's you have extremely powerful wizards, extremely powerful monsters, extremely powerful like ancient horrors that are unleashed upon the world. I mean, the Malazan military alone contains tons of extremely powerful wizards who can alter the course of the battlefield and have amazing levels of power at their disposal. And you see some of this in very early in Gardens of the Moon when there's the flashback to the siege on Pale, and some of the magic in this world is shown to you and how powerful some of the characters are. So it kind of sets the tone for the rest of the series, and it's just like it's 10 out of 10 on the power scale, and it's really interesting the way Malazan works with that. So again, like all these characters with special powers, you've got like on top of the wizards themselves, you've also got like the gods and ascendants. The ascendants are kind of like the superheroes and supervillains in a way, because a lot of them have like special powers. They have special access to warrens or magic items or whatever that really make them kind of like final boss level characters in terms of their overall um, capabilities. And, well, I mean, gods are basically ascendants, but the gods have worshippers. But there's all these ascendants walking around. And a lot of times, there's different reasons why they have these abilities or these power levels or this special magic access. It's not always explained. Sometimes it's connected to a god or it's connected to something specific. Other times it just kind of, like, that's just kind of the way they are, and it's not really clear why all the times, but usually some kind of event or relationship affects why they're like that. Um, and I mean, like, a lot of series you might have, a character, often a bad guy, or, maybe a mysterious good guy who can influence the story, but not so directly. Like, you might have one character who could, say, destroy an entire city by himself. And that would be a really special thing in most fantasy series. Might even be like the final enemy that you have to fight, like someone that powerful, and that's the threat they represent. Malazan has just tons and tons and tons of characters who can do that. And so it really changes a lot of the dynamic of the world where everything's taking place, and the way in which people can influence things and the different levels at which the story is taking place, because some people obviously can't really fight or interact effectively with power levels that are way above their own, but Malazan and Erickson does a really good job with the lower level characters in contributing in a valuable way to the story. And a lot of times they themselves will sort of level up, so to speak. They may become ascendants, or different things might happen where their ability to alter or influence the story is very considerable. But let's see. So that being said, like there are kind of the different tiers of power levels. And some guys can take out a whole army by themselves, so to speak, or some guys can like go toe to toe with gods. But for the lower level characters, there is kind of an interesting thing in Malazan that I guess in some ways there's sort of a rock paper scissors thing. Like just because A can defeat B and B can defeat C doesn't mean C cannot defeat A. You know what I mean? And it's not always just a pure like raw measurement on the power meter. Like there's different things that are more effective against different kinds of enemies. But for the lower level characters, Malazan has some interesting things that help them kind of interact with some of those higher level battles too. For the Malazan Empire in particular, they have kind of their special weapon, which is their munitions or their explosives, gunpowder and such, basically. And that's really important because they can, like the sappers of the Malazan army are some of the most dangerous characters in the whole series, I would say. Like you can destroy gods or ascendants with explosives, because it also seems to have some sort of like it seems like effective. Maybe I'm mixed up, but I think they talk about this at one point where it's like explosives are a good counter to magic, and I think it has some like almost negative magic aspect, but I kind of forget. Maybe I'm mixed up. There's also auditoral weapons, which some characters are privileged to have. Like an auditoral sword is like an anti-magic sword, and so someone who's a good fighter with one of these swords could take on like a god or an ascendant, and just kind of an interesting thing again, because you have to have some opportunities for lower level characters to influence the story or take on someone much stronger than themselves. There's also an interesting aspect to the story where kind of an ongoing theme of Malazan is that power draws power. There's always these so-called convergences that they worry about in the story. Like that word will be used often, like people talking about a convergence. The principle being power draws power. And if one really powerful person or entity is coming into play because they have an objective, other super powerful entities are also going to become interested in what's going on, and usually they end up converging, and it's a huge disaster. So people are worried about the idea of power draws power. It's like a, not just a theme, but it's almost like a force within the world, or a principle that the world operates on. And so that sets up kind of a way the pattern works in pretty much every Malazan book, where you have all these different things going on. Scattered around are these super, super powerful characters. And generally towards the end of the book, a lot of these super powerful characters are converged into one place where, the shit hits the fan, so to speak. Pardon my language. So it's just cool the way they kind of use that idea. And it means that there's always like, even if you're super, super powerful, there's a big risk to you getting involved in things because someone else really powerful is likely going to show up. And so the really most powerful characters have to be careful about the way they get involved in things. And that kind of goes to another thing that I think is actually interesting about Malazan that's really effective in Erikson's writing. And also Esselmont. He does this well too, but Erikson, I think, just has a real knack for this. And it's basically like writing believable high-level characters. Writing believable gods and ascendants and super high-powered wizards who have lived like hundreds of years or what have you. And just the way Erikson writes their dialogue and how they think and what their motives are and what they're doing, it just feels like it's got a believability to it, because you can think like if you're this powerful and this old, this ancient, you're going to think differently than average person like us is going to think, or even an average person in the Malazan world, with very different sets of priorities and planning horizons and weaknesses and vulnerabilities. The high level characters, I just love the way Malazan, the way they're written in the Malazan Book of the Fallen. To me, that's one of the most interesting things, is kind of learning about and getting into the heads of some of these strange characters. Sometimes you don't get it from their point of view per se, but you'll have other characters interacting with them, and of course things are revealed about those super powerful characters by their own actions and dialogue, their own spoken word, which again, like, you get kind of this picture that really seems believable to me about what these super high powered characters would be like. And sometimes in fantasy books, I find like the super almost cosmically powerful characters there's almost like an irony or lack of seriousness to it, and there's none of that in Malazan. Like sometimes they are kind of weird or eccentric, or sometimes, occasionally, depending on which ones you're talking about, they can almost seem kind of frivolous and silly in other ways. But the Malazan high level characters are really, really well done, and the way they just exist in the world just seems believable and cool. So on top of that, like, well, I don't know, maybe there's an example, like, so a funny one maybe is Calor, King Calor, and he's a bad guy basically. Moral ambiguity, of course, is a thing that goes with Malazan, but Calor is just kind of a bad guy. There's not too much ambiguous about him. And he's been around for like thousands of years, if I'm not mistaken. And when you meet him, he's just kind of hanging around. Like, he's kind of just looking for something to do, and he kind of just wants to screw with people. And he's just kind of hanging around with Caladan Brood's army, and you're like, who is this guy? What's he up to? And you learn more about him, and it's kind of like, okay, I can see why he's there. And again, I don't know, it might sound strange, or maybe I'm not explaining it well, but it seems believable. Like, he's super powerful, long-lived person, and he has to find something to do as well. And it's like when a guy retires or sells his company that was his entire life, and then doesn't know what to do after. So he gets kind of back into the same sort of stuff, maybe on a different scale or what have you. But Calor's kind of like that, and I like Calor. He's a great character, even though you don't really see him that much overall. It's just there's something about the way he's written, and it's not unique to Calor. All these kind of high level characters tend to be really believable, just the way they are. I like that about Erickson's books. But like I was talking a bit earlier about the levels of the power, and I think back to like, although there are some tricks and some balancing effects, you could say, a lot of times, like, a low-level character will never stand any chance against a higher-level character, and it makes me think of the old mathematical experience system in the third edition of Dungeons and Dragons. There's like the chart on experience and leveling up, and the mathematical idea behind that chart and the way the difficulty ratings are supposed to work is that, like, a level 5 character is equal in difficulty per se to another level 5 character. And then every 2 levels you go up, that's like supposed to be, in theory, twice as powerful. So a level 7 character would be as strong or as difficult an encounter as a 2 level 5 characters. Or another way of saying that is just a level 7 character should be twice as powerful as a level 5 character. And so it's like a 50-50 matchup. It's kind of like final boss level in that game when, say, 4 level 5 characters, like 4 hero characters, fight a level 9 character, because he's 4 levels higher. So that's basically, he's as good as 4 level 5 characters, if that makes sense. And Malazan's kind of like that. It's kind of got the logarithmic scale on the power level. So you think at the low level you've got, soldiers hacking at each other with swords and crossbows and stuff. All the way up you've got the, high level characters, which are many orders of magnitude more powerful than those low level characters. And the way, in something like Dungeons and Dragons, where you can just, a high level character can fight 100 orcs and not feel any danger at all, you do get that in Malazan. It's kind of got a similar mathematical principle there. And I mean, Erickson and Nesselmont started Malazan as a role-playing game world, like their campaign world where they would play the game. So you can kind of see, like, the echoes of that, and the way the different power levels relate to each other kind of actually comes from sort of the spontaneous results of playing a cooperative storytelling game, like an RPG with rules and with, like, such a dramatic power level scaling like you would get in, like, old 2nd or 3rd edition Dungeons and Dragons. So it just feels kind of true to life in a sense, if that makes sense, because if you've played Dungeons and Dragons or something like that at a very low level all the way up to the high level, you can kind of see how a setting emerges from those rules and the rules behind, like, power level scaling. And Malazan kind of feels like that. There's actually a lot of fantasy books that come from RPG campaign worlds, but Malazan, I think you feel it almost more there, even though it's like the literary quality is quite a bit higher than, say, like a pulpy Dragonlance or Forgotten Realms book. Malazan, it still in a lot of ways does have kind of an RPG feel to it, in a sense that once you're really leveled up, like, it's a whole different universe for you and the whole different kinds of adventures. Now, kind of an interesting thing to think about, power levels and stuff. Just for comparison, again, going back to Game of Thrones, we call that like a really low level fantasy world. Yeah, there's some dragons, and they can do basically like aerial bombardments on places. You've got some wizards, you've got some undead stuff, but for the most part, it's low level action or low power level action, and that's okay. Nothing wrong with that. It's just a different kind of story. There's other kinds of things too, and just to kind of give Malazan more of a comparison, like it's top of the chart. So think about something else like Wheel of Time. That's a very high-powered series, I would say. The magic users are extremely powerful, and there's lots of other different kind of monsters and characters that can have a considerable danger even to those high-level characters. But that's a very high-powered series, I would say. And Malazan is much, much higher than that. But it's a lot closer to Wheel of Time than it is to Game of Thrones. And of course, part of the Malazan thing is it's not just like the most powerful characters are, of course, extremely powerful, but in terms of number of them, they're relatively more rare than they are in Malazan. Malazan has a lot more, like a greater number of the super powerful characters, and that kind of just brings up the whole power level of the series in the way we're kind of thinking. Now, a few other series, like, I don't know, what's another kind of high-powered series for comparison? Well, I mean, Forgotten Realms or something. Like, if you think of all those old Forgotten Realms novels, that is a high-powered setting. A lot of those stories aren't necessarily high-powered, but a lot of them are. And, again, I'd say Malazan is in some ways kind of closer to like a big Forgotten Realms world where you've got like level 20 characters kind of scattered all over the place along with more mid-power characters who, again, are very much bigger game changers than the lowest level people. But I'd say Malazan, in general, just has a way heavier, higher powered feel than that. And also, again, it unlike, say, a Forgotten Realms thing, or if you're kind of consistent with the game, there's basically like a hard cutoff where you cannot deal with challenges that are too high above your level. But there are some different methods and tricks that are available sometimes to the lower level Malazan characters, which is important, and it creates a few interesting surprises in places. And sometimes, again, like, it's not entirely clear why they're so powerful. I mean, it just seems like they are really amazing fighters with incredible durability, and they go up against almost like godlike enemies, and they can meet the challenge. But it's not like they have like an explicit superpower or a set of magic abilities or something. Sometimes it's a little more ambiguous or unclear, but I like how Malazan doesn't kind of lay out the entire nooks and crannies of all the rules of the magic and power system. Like, there's kind of some mystery behind the veil about how exactly everything works, although there's a lot of clues and you get different ideas that kind of come together as you read through the series. I don't know, what else? Like Conan the Barbarian, the great short stories from Robert E. Howard. Some of my favorites of all time, but that's very low-powered stuff. Like, Conan is a low-powered character overall. He has lots of different abilities, like sometimes he's a pirate, he's a warrior, he's a general, he's a rogue. He does all kinds of stuff. But he's not a really high-powered character. And even a lot of the enemies he fights, they're, monsters or wizards. They are powerful within that context, but they're not like super powerful, like compared to something like Wheel of Time or Malazan. Another kind of old short stories I like are Elric, like the Elric of Melniboné series from Michael Moorcock. Now, Elric, in some ways, that is a fairly high-powered setting, but Elric in particular is a super high-powered character. But a lot of the stuff he interacts with, or the world more generally, isn't super high powered, although he does obviously encounter a lot of the high powered elements within it. But again, I'd say it's much less powered up than Malazan because there's just not as many people like Elric in the world, whereas Malazan has all kinds of Elric type guys walking around in terms of, again, their overall strength. So yeah, this is one of the things that are most cool about Malazan. If you do like kind of the high-powered fantasy stuff, Malazan is like nothing else. And to illustrate that as kind of the visual here, we have just one moment, one brief kind of face-off in the first book where the Jaghut tyrant Raced faces off against 5 dragons. And he's so powerful that he doesn't even really care. Like he basically deals with these guys. And this is just one moment near the climax of Gardens of the Moon that's really epic and crazy. But it's just kind of a regular day in Malazan, so to speak. And it's awesome. Gardens of the Moon, of course, is a great book. It's got lots of high-powered stuff, but once you get farther into the series and you start piling up all these crazy high-powered characters which are interacting with the story and the world and all these things that are happening, things get pretty wild and out of hand. And it's one of the reasons why it's such a great series. So if you do like high-powered fantasy series and you're thinking about the Malazan thing, Malazan, I can almost certainly assure you that it is the, if not the most high-powered fantasy series you'll ever come across. And it's just so epic and awesome. And the way it builds up to like these showdowns between these superpowered characters is really, really good and basically always super satisfying. So Malazan is awesome. I think we'll just leave it at that. Talk to you later.